Well, good evening, and thank you for such a warm welcome. It is truly an honor to have the opportunities to speak with a group like yourselves that are so active in promoting peace. As I was thinking about what I might speak to you about tonight when I was still back in the U.S., I began listening to the testimonies that you have collected from survivors of Hiroshima and survivors of Nagasaki. And I was deeply, deeply moved. So ever since I was a child and learned about the war in school, I of course knew what happened, knew intellectually what happened, but hearing the testimonies and then visiting the museum this afternoon, it's so much more real for me. So knowing that it's my country that dropped the bomb, it's with great humility that I speak to you tonight, and deeply inspired that out of that terrible, terrible atrocity, that terrible tragedy, that you are working so hard for peace to make sure that nothing like that should happen ever again. So I titled my talk tonight, Finding Our Common Humanity in a Fractured World, because I believe right now our world is in trouble. It is fractured. Our world is facing unprecedented challenges, and these challenges will require greater collaboration between all the countries of the world than we've ever seen before. But instead, what we're seeing is increased polarization, increased conflict within countries, increased conflict between countries, and a global decline in democracy. And as a peace builder, it's my belief that it's in recognizing our common humanity across all our differences, that's what will reduce polarization, that's what reduces conflict. Ultimately, that's what will help promote democracy and help us meet the challenges of our times. When I visited the museum this afternoon, I was especially moved by the personal stories, the stories of the children who lost their lives. And when I saw those stories of the children, I thought of my own grandchildren. And it's when we feel that, it's just my fellow human being, that helps us to build peace. So I will share some stories from my work at peace building in conflict zones in other parts of the world about how we work to build this sense of common humanity, even after wars, even after genocide. And I'll also, in our question and answer time, hope to hear stories from you about some of the ways you're working to help develop this sense of our common humanity worldwide. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the global trends that we're seeing, just to emphasize the very big challenges that we're facing right now, and particularly as Ikeda just mentioned, my focus at the Toda Peace Institute is on the global challenges to democracy. So I'm going to speak a little bit about that, as well as challenges around growing conflict around the world. And then we'll move on to what we can perhaps do about it. So at the end of World War II, there were very few democracies in the world. But then in the decades after, there was a great growth in democracy all around the world. Two main factors. One was decolonization and independence movements in Africa, Latin America, Asian countries. So many democracies sprung up. And then after the fall and decline of communism, Eastern Europe, many democracies as well. So the number of democracies in the world grew very fast and very high. But in the last 10 years, that trend has reversed. And the level of democracy now is back down to the same level as the 1980s. Declined dramatically. 72% of the world's population, that's nearly 3/4 of the world's population, now live in what we call autocracies. So either dictatorships or electoral autocracies, which means they have elections, but really there's no freedom of speech, no freedom of civil society. And that's an increase of 46%, so almost 50% from 10 years ago. So what does this mean? Freedom of expression is declining. Government censorship of media is increasing. Increased government repression of civil society, and the quality of elections is declining. India, which is the world's largest democracy, was founded on the principle of pluralism, of including all languages, all religions, all ethnic groups. But now Narendra Modi is prepared to win a landslide election, and his goal is to replace that pluralism with Hindu nationalism. In Indonesia, Subianto just won the election. He's a former military general who, under the dictator Suharto, committed terrible human rights abuses. But he was actually kicked out of the Indonesian military because of his abuses. But now he just wins the election as president, and apparently he gathered a lot of the youth vote. In Indonesia, they called him Gemoy, which is a word, it means apparently cuddly grandfather. So somehow he recast himself as this warm, kind grandfather, when in fact he's someone who committed terrible abuses. And he says the country doesn't need elections, it doesn't need democracy. The only thing that's important is to keep the economy growing. And sadly, in my own country, in the U.S., Trump may win the election again, and he has 4 indictments against him, 91 felony charges, and still he may win an election. And I could give you many other examples from other parts of the world, but we would be here way too far into the night. It's also true, according to the UN, that we currently have the highest number of violent conflicts since World War II, and that 1/4 of the world's population lives in places that are affected by those conflicts. A UN survey also determined that 6 out of 7 people in the world feel plagued by insecurity. They don't feel confident about the future. So the big question is, what is happening in our world? Why this decline in democracy? Why do people no longer trust democracy? What is going on? I don't think there's any one single factors. I think what we're seeing is an interaction of many factors that are building upon each other. The amount of inequality in the world has grown tremendously, both within countries and between countries. There's a statistic now that 1% of the world owns 46% of the world's wealth. We have these multi-billionaires like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos of Amazon accumulating more and more wealth, while there's still so much poverty in the world. And this creates deep grievances. There's a huge amount of youth unemployment in many parts of the world. In some African countries, it's as much as 80%. And then with all those problems, with all the conflicts, we have mass migration. So many people trying to leave Africa to get into Europe. So many people from Latin America trying to get into the U.S. And this leads to xenophobia, to people worried that we're going to lose our national identity. We need to keep the immigrants out. And then I believe there's a lot of existential fear because of the real dangers of climate change, of environmental degradation, of species going extinct. And that this leads to a deep anxiety. Then, of course, we have social media as well, which is leading to conspiracy theories, leading to a lot of polarization. So with all these factors interacting with each other, I think it leads to a tremendous amount of anxiety. And then what starts to happen is people look to a strongman leader who they think will solve all their problems. In Africa recently, there have been 8 military coups, often with a lot of popular support, because people just don't believe that democracy is going to solve their problems. So with all these challenges, I think it's very easy to get discouraged. I have friends in the U.S. who tell me, I don't want to listen to the news anymore because I get too depressed. We look to entertainment to distract ourselves because we don't want to face the problems in front of us. But I think this is the biggest danger. Yeah. Because I believe we have to look at these challenges squarely to really recognize the very real challenges ahead of us, but then think, what's possible? What can be done? Where can we, whether we're the Youth Peace Committee here in Hiroshima or different groups in different parts of the world, what can we do? One of the projects, we're doing a couple of projects that I'll mention at Toda Peace Institute on our Challenges to Democracy research area. One is we're trying to create maps of all these different interacting challenges to think with civil society leaders. Where can you take action? How can you affect things to bring about, strategically bring about change? What can women do? What is their particular strength? What can youth do? What can journalists do? What can politicians do? It takes so many different actors at different levels of society to try to shift these very negative trends that I'm speaking about. Another project we're doing is we're creating something called the Democracy Lighthouse, which will be a platform that will be a consortium of all kinds of democracy institutes from many, many different parts of the world. And we'll have it interactive, so you can go to some part of the map, some country in Africa, some country in Asia, and South America, and see who's doing what kinds of organizations exist. First for democracy, but I also hope we'll be adding peace institutes as well, so that we have a sense of a network of all these different efforts that are happening in so many different corners of the world. The other thing that I think is so important is, it comes more from my peace building work. So from my peace building work, working in places like Bosnia, in Kosovo, in Sri Lanka after the Civil War, in Rwanda after the genocide, I've heard so many stories about the very worst that human beings are capable of doing to each other. And certainly living here in Hiroshima and knowing your history, you have a deep experience of the very, very worst that human beings can inflict upon another group of human beings. And people often ask me, Olivia, don't you get depressed doing that work? And actually I say no. I'm deeply inspired because what I really see is the power of human resilience. And you have certainly seen the power of human resilience here in Hiroshima, both the way in which this city rebuilt itself and the way in which it became a center, it was the epicenter of the bomb, but now it's the epicenter to push for the abolition of nuclear bombs and for world peace. And I see that same phenomena in almost every country where I've worked, where actually what evolves after the horrors of what happens is this deep commitment to create a better future for future generations. In Rwanda, where I've worked a lot over the years, where they had such a terrible genocide, between 700,000 and 1 million people were killed within 100 days. Hard to imagine. The Hutus who perpetuated the genocide were not terrible people. Many of them were uneducated. There was an extremist government. There was hate radio. They were told lies. They thought if they didn't kill, they would be killed. They were manipulated by fear. And in our programs where we create opportunities for dialogue, for deep listening to each other, for really trying to understand each group, trying to understand the experience of the other. Also trauma workshops, both for survivors and for the perpetrators who also are traumatized and full of shame for the atrocities they've committed. So we have done that kind of work. We even did trauma healing workshops for the survivors and the ex-perpetrators together so that they realize both have experienced trauma. And through these workshops together, they were able to kind of rediscover each other's humanity. And then we combined that with projects with youth where they formed peace committees within their communities, combining both Hutu and Tutsi youth, the two groups, where they were in dialogue also with the older generation because they felt nobody was talking about the genocide. The youth wanted to understand what had happened. So really getting everybody to address the history together. And for me, these stories are not just for Rwanda, they're also for the world. Just as the testimonies that you have gathered in Hiroshima are not just for Japan, but they're also for the world. And I feel like this is something we can do in these times, is really lift up these stories that can give hope for how we create a better future. So I want to conclude with one example also that I learned about recently from Japan, which none of my Japanese colleagues have heard of, but I find very interesting, which is these, I have learned that in several cities in Japan now, there are citizen assemblies organized by the local government to meet together to talk about what people want to see for the future in their city, to help with city planning. But as part of what I understand in Japan is called the future design movement, they ask half the group to pretend that they are citizens living in the year 2060. And they are given traditional yellow Japanese robes to wear, so as a kind of role play. And they have to think about the city as though they were living in a future generation. And there's been research on this work, and what they find is that those who think they're the citizens of 2060 come up with much more progressive and creative solutions, because they're not just thinking about their own interests and needs, they're thinking about future generations. So it's led me to think if we really want to create democratic societies, we should also be thinking about future generations and what kind of world we're leaving for future generations. So I think I want to end especially by speaking to the youth in the room and to say, please don't lose hope. Please don't lose hope that there's a lot in the world right now that is very challenging. And it is very important to look at those challenges and to take them seriously. But there's a lot that can be done. And I have heard the work that you're currently doing. I just learned today about this preparation for this youth festival in Tokyo in March. 70,000 youth in the stadium, and that you've had this survey going around Japan, and that you are going to deliver the findings, especially around climate change and the need to abolish nuclear weapons, to deliver them to the UN for the UN Summit of the Future. I think that's wonderful. I congratulate you, and I just really want to encourage you, because I think that kind of engagement in helping to shape your future is the most important thing you can do, both to creating a more democratic world and a more peaceful world. So thank you, and I welcome your questions. From what I've heard about what you're doing, I think you're doing a great job, and I'm not sure that I have advice for you, because I think what you're more important than anything, more important than the specifics of the question or how you're doing it, is you're demonstrating something by example. And you're creating this event that's exciting, that people really want to participate in. And I think that that's infectious in a good way. And it sounds fun. There's going to be music, so it's something that people want to participate in. And I think just youth feeling that they can have a voice, and that this will be sent to the UN, and that's empowering, that's important, and it encourages youth engagement rather than this feeling of, oh, we can't do anything, nothing is going to change. It's a very good question, and not an easy question to answer. I think the fear is understandable, because people do want to preserve their culture. But the reality is also that we live in a globalized world. And as climate change increases, there's going to be more and more migration. The whole north of Africa is drying up. People are trying to leave. There are parts of the world that will become too hot to live in. There are islands in the Pacific that are sinking. Over the next decades, there's going to be a lot of movement of human populations. At the same time, I don't think we can just have open borders. Some countries would be completely overrun. So I think a lot of the structures we have, like the UN and so forth, were built for a different time. So there is a lot of discussion now on, what's the new architecture that we'll need for 21st century problems. And the problems we're facing, the challenges we're facing, whether it's climate change or the next pandemic, they're not within nation states. These are problems that cross national boundaries that are affecting the whole world. So how, as humankind, we're going to negotiate all those problems is a big challenge. And then in that mix, I totally agree with you that we want to respect our cultural differences, religious differences, that in that diversity is tremendous richness and strength. And how to maintain that at the same time that we are having as humankind to face all these problems together. So I think it's going to be, it's a challenge and require a lot of careful thinking and engagement. If I take the example of America, there's a lot more we could be doing to support countries in Central America that are having so many challenges, whether it's in Haiti or El Salvador where there's so much gang violence. If we could help them address those problems, they wouldn't all be trying to come into the U.S. People don't want to leave their homes. They don't want to leave the land where they grew up. But when they feel like they have no other choice, they do.
Thank you very much.